the team, not new to Telford and Wrekin, but new in this role. So thank you for joining us. I would like to start, please, by taking any apologies for absence. I don't believe we've received any this evening. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Chair. We've received no apologies for absence.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll move on to any declarations of interest. Can members please indicate whether they have any? No, that's fine. So we can move on. Minutes of the previous meeting. It was a good meeting. Good to be back in the chair, and thank you, Vanessa, again for covering in the interim. If I could please get a proposer and a seconder that these are a true and accurate copy.
Chair, can I just interrupt? It's Councillor Blundell here. I actually sent my apologies on the 29th of January, stating that I wouldn't be able to make the meeting on February, but they haven't been noted.
Okay, could I please remind members to indicate, please, when they would like to speak? Thank you, Karen.
Okay.
That can be noted in the minutes for this meeting if you'd wish.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Right. So minutes of the previous meeting, I believe I had Richard and Angela agree to propose and second, so that'll be carried. Thank you, everybody. Now, moving on, we will now have a presentation on the Local Government Boundary Commission for England's review of electoral arrangements. So I would like to hand over so that we can receive it. Thank you, everyone. Phil, I think that's you, although it says Anthea in the...
Chair, it's likely that Phil will do the lion's share, and then I'll be available for questions at the end. So I'm just going to share the presentation. If you just bear with me a second.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
As we've experienced earlier, I am having a few technical problems, but I'm sure it'll be resolved shortly. It looks like it might be working now. So I'm going to ask that age-old question. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
That's positive. I think we're good to go, Chair.
Brilliant. If members could please mute themselves while not speaking, and just a reminder to please indicate if you have questions. And Anthea, you'll be taking those at the end, won't you?
Happy to do it either during or at the end, Chair, whichever is easiest for members.
Okay, well, let's take them at the end and see the presentation the whole way through. Thank you. Right.
Right, councillors, I'm going to give you a presentation now on the review of the electoral arrangements and council size submission. So this might be recapping, so my apologies if it is. In terms of the Boundary Commission's work, they've got three key statutory criteria. So electoral equality, as far as possible, community identity, and effective and convenient local government, basically how we do our work. They attempt to balance those three criteria. Looking at electoral equality as close as possible across the area, reflecting the identities and interests of our communities, taking into account location and boundaries of parishes, physical features of our areas, and they seek easily identifiable boundaries which will not break local ties. And probably the most important of the three, the need to secure effective and convenient local government now and in the future. So that we're looking forward to 2027. When we make a submission on council size, we will provide information for figures up to that date. Timetable. I think you've probably seen this, but there's been a slight change just in terms of their approach on this, where they've told us that for the 16th of April, we can make a soft submission, so where they'll give us some feedback on our council size submission, and a final date of the 23rd. So hopefully we'll be able to take advantage of that so that they can give us any feedback or any comments on that submission, and further on to 18th of May 2021, where they should be sitting to make a decision on that council size submission. They want to look at several different size options being explored, and further through the presentation I'll show you what we're proposing on that. They'd like us to think about what numbers would be required if the council was newly established today and looking forward into the future for the work to be conducted. Strategic leadership, i.e. the cabinet, decision making of our committees, accountability and community leadership of our councillors. So basically, we've got the cabinet, we've got the scrutiny, regulatory and partnership functions, and the representational role of elected members. And they obviously look for best practice to provide an evidence base to support that submission, and they will test it. Optimum number of electors per councillor is the starting point, and they would look for well-reasoned proposals which demonstrate the individual characteristics and needs of our authority and our communities, i.e. they want us to demonstrate why it's a suitable council size. They'll test those assumptions and they will ask questions. 2020 electorate and the projections for 2027. So 5 years hence, they're looking for projections at that point as to what our electorate base will be. We've currently got 30 wards returning 54 councillors and a total of 133,197 electors. That averages 2,467 electors to each councillor. Looking at future growth, that estimate is coming back at 141,954 by 2027. And that gives us an average of 2,629 electors based on our current 54 councillors. The number of wards as part of the further part of the review could change. We have 30 at the moment. Forecast growth. So we're looking at about a 6.6% increase from now to 2027, 8,757 electors. We've got significant growth across the area, really, but there are particular hotspots. We know about the Lawley scenario, so those are affecting Horsey and Lightmoor, Ketley and Overdale wards, leading to the review. Further growth in the central Telford area. Around those areas, there's a Rockwoodine part that touches onto the Lawley development, and there are further larger developments in North Telford as well. Currently in Prisley, there's quite a lot of building going on there. So the number that we need to manage our business and provide effective representation, again, it's back to this effective and convenient local government. They want to ensure that our arrangements, regulatory and scrutiny, all work effectively, that our communities retain their identities, i.e. we don't break identities by the work going forward in the review. Our options for consideration, looking at the situation for a council where we've got quite a high element of growth, is we could look at a slight increase, a slight reduction or retention of the current council size. And that was our starting point for consideration as officers looking at this. So that range could be between 53 and 56 councillors. In terms of our executive scrutiny and regulatory, I've got a slide up there that just gives you a taste of the numbers of councillors that are involved in particular in the cabinet, the scrutiny, different boards and committees. There's a lot more to councillors' work as well in terms of their ward work, but we will be looking at making in the submission this information statistical and also gaining information from councillors' work in terms of where their time is taken, getting a good picture for how busy our councillors are. This came from the Boundary Commission. In terms of unitary authorities, we appear to be in broadly the median range for numbers. The median is 55.5. We're obviously slightly lower than that at the moment, but as you saw on the previous slides, we're looking at consideration initially between 53 and 56. And similar authorities there. Some are higher, up towards the 60 mark, and some are lower. So if we looked at those numbers and we translated what we talked about, so a 54-member council would now move up to 2,629 electors per councillor. 55 would be 2,581, and 56, 2,535. In terms of recommendations, what we would recommend this evening is that the committee not consider a reduction. We believe that that ratio is probably pushing that too high for good representation for our communities. But we do believe that in the range between 54 and 56, that the officers, if councillors wish, should go away and put information together on each of those 3 options, and at the next meeting consider those proposals and ultimately approve a submission, whether that's at the next meeting or the one after, to the Boundary Commission on council size. Next steps, need to do some work with consultation groups. I think we've got a significant number of groups that we will offer that information to the Boundary Commission that they can contact as part of the process. I believe that we should pull together a brief councillor questionnaire, quite punchy, but basically asking councillors for their workloads and how their time is spent. Obviously, we're in unusual times with COVID, but to give an indication of how our members are occupied. A number of members are on a lot of committees. They've got a lot of outside body representations, etc. We'll continue to prepare a submission for information based on the agreement tonight of whatever the committee decides. And we're heading towards a final date for submission of council size, 23rd of April. And ultimately that will come back and we'll go into the second stage of the review. Any questions for myself and Anthea? Happy to take them.
Can't see anybody indicating at the moment. If they do have questions, oh, 1 second, Angela.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is it questions or comments, Bill?
Sorry, either, Angela. So apologies for that. No, any feedback or any thoughts from councillors? We're just looking really in terms of our recommendations. We think that is the route to start going forward with those numbers. I'd be interested to hear what the committee thought.
Yeah, well, sort of, I suppose my initial reaction is that we do need good representation. That is absolutely clear. I don't think we should have less councillors. You know, I would rule that out, to be quite honest. So, I mean, based on the growth that's coming up in, if we look at Lawley and Priorslee in particular, there are massive growth areas there, and I think just based on the electoral numbers per councillor, I think we could. I think it would be sensible for us to have a slight increase in the number of councillors. You know, whether that's, I don't know, whether we stay with the status quo or go to 55 or 56, but I'm happy to sort of, you know, have a discussion about that. But my view would be definitely not less councillors.
Thank you, Councillor McClements. Councillor Overton.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it's remarkable in the amount of growth that's projected there. You know, and as ward councillors who get quite a lot of casework already, to see too much in growth in your ward can, you know, give you no time at all, especially when you're on lots of things. So I think it is, you know, I've always favoured status quo, but having seen the growth numbers, I think that the options that the officers have put forward of looking at 54, 55, 56 are sensible, and then we can see how that affects. Well, we saw the figures there, you know, the difference in the increase, because you know, it you know, as Andrew said, local representation is important, but you can't, you know, you need to make sure councillors are able to do it as well, and to have too much and overload people means people won't want to come to be a council anyway. You know, we have to make sure we're not putting people off by giving them too much work. You know, and you know, because it is, you know, because depending what role you do, it can be full-time job. You know, and those people who work, you know, well, shouldn't be put off by this, and those people who've got childcare commitments, etc., etc. I mean, it's very important that we make democracy accountable and representational. And so I think that the committees. Well, the officers' recommendations are perfectly viable recommendations, and we should support them so we can see those when they come back before we make our submission.
Brilliant. Thank you, Councillor Overton. I'm glad to see Councillor Duckmore's hand up because I was about to invite comments from our colleagues on the other side of the floor. So yes, Councillor Duckmore.
Yeah, fine, thanks. Right, well, thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting and not really much of a surprise, I think. We all know that there are growth areas in the borough, as well as some static areas as well, which haven't changed very much. So I very much welcome to see the figures working it out from 53 to 56. I mean, just using 54 as the baseline. I mean, with the projected growth, 53 would be an extra 49 per councillor, and 55 would be 48 less. So you know, it really is quite the median there. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what you come up with, Phil, for doing the projections for the different numbers. Yep. And because as I say, I mean, growth hasn't been uniform across the borough, so it'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
Thank you, Councillor Duckmore. Phil, would you like to come back about that? Or? Yeah,
no, I think good point made by Nigel. In any review, when we go into it, you'll find an uneven element. You'll have some areas that are already completely developed, others that are developing. That will create more challenges for us into the second stage. The first stage, they will decide on a number, but they may, as the review goes forward, they may choose to alter that number by maybe 1 if they find that the warding is extremely difficult through that stage. They reserve that right, but I think, yeah, no, it's a very good point made there.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillor Blundell.
I'd just like to say I appreciate the table with the projected growth and the councillor numbers. I find that very interesting. One question I did have was suggesting a councillor questionnaire, bearing in mind we'll have Easter in between. Have we any idea when that would be likely to be sent out to all councillors?
I may defer to Anthea on that one, just in terms of a little bit more guidance on that. As soon as possible, Karen, I would have thought, once we've got it created, a fairly short one.
Thank you.
Chair, would you like me to come in on that?
Yes, please.
I think we'll be guided by the committee, Chair. So in an ideal situation, we would probably want this committee just to give their nod of approval, if you like, to the questions that are going to be answered, because we want to make sure it's meaningful to members. The last thing that although officers work well with members, we can't possibly understand what it's like to be in your shoes. So for us to create a questionnaire, really it would be useful to get this committee's feedback. There's one or two ways that we can do that. We could either bring it to the next meeting, and I think the chair is going to give an update on the plans for the timetable moving forward. But if it was felt that that was too tight to allow for completion, Phil and I can work on it outside of the meeting, and we can circulate it by email to members. So perhaps it's something that a final decision could be made on once, Chair, you've updated members on the proposals for meetings moving forward to get us to the submission date.
Brilliant, thank you, Anthea. Okay, well, I could do that now if Councillor Greenaway doesn't mind waiting a moment with a question. So what we were thinking was that the week commencing the 5th of April, given the tight deadlines that we're working towards at the moment, that we would have 3 meetings in each week for the following 3 weeks, pending democratic services, having a look through people's diaries and getting clearance for clashes, etc. So if members are happy with that provisionally, I'm sure Democratic Services will get on and provide us with some dates once they've had a look through everybody's diaries. How does that sound? Could I get a... Yeah, okay, I'll take that as lack of dissent. Brilliant. Okay, Councillor Greenaway, please, thank you.
Yeah, I'll need to add my voice to that. Oh, it looks as if I'm having a problem with the hand again. Just to add another voice to it, yeah, I completely agree. I think it depends how good the projections are, as to how that's going to pan out, obviously. And, you know, we're not always to know what's going to happen getting close to 2027. But I think at this point in time, I think we've got to bear an open mind. I mean, I know what it's like being in a ward that it is growing substantially with a lot of development, and that in itself causes a lot more issues than you would normally face. But I think we have to see, and I'm quite right, Phil, everybody's agreed that table is quite useful. It doesn't seem a lot, I suppose, in the bigger scheme of things when you look at the differences between the lower numbers and the high numbers, but again, it will depend on the projections, and they can be very localized as well, which is probably going to cause the problems.
I think that's a good point, Jane. I think when I left 5 years ago, it was 2,200 per elector. So I think you can see that the rate is quite rapid, and you've got to imagine that after 2027 that rate could continue. Now, those numbers that we've got from our team, John Power's team, obviously we will put to the LGBCE. They will then look at that. They'll again test that data. Those numbers could alter in a small manner. I wouldn't think a lot, but they will obviously test that. But they've been all done on the information they've asked us. How it's provided is in a certain way, and that's the way they've provided it. It's quite surprising growth, though.
Yeah, and we have noticed that when you look at the figures from the electoral rolls, etc. But of course, there's a discrepancy between the electoral numbers and the numbers of possibles, if you like, because that makes a huge difference, because there's a number of wards that actually have got less electors, but they're not identified because obviously not registered, or there may be a high number, I suppose, in that area of rental properties, and there's not that registration, but the potential is there to have a lot more than we actually have in some of the wards, because looking down the figures.
I think that's a very good point. I think that would be part of the submission, is to point out that we have areas where registration rates are not particularly excellent. It doesn't mean those people aren't there, but they'll obviously only consider the numbers of valid electors. But I think that's part of the story that is told in terms of if you cross the town, you've got very different pictures in different parts, different borough wards.
Thanks.
Thank you both. Anthea.
Just a couple of points, Chair. So in terms of the question around how good are the projections, I think the Boundary Commission itself says that there's no guarantees when it comes to doing reviews. The only guarantee is that it won't be right, because it's based on projections. So it's an estimate. But what I would say is the brief that officers were given to provide us with the figures for projections was to be on the safe side. So they've been fairly conservative in the approach that they've taken. So the numbers that they are projecting are numbers that officers are confident will be delivered. And you're right, it is localized, but the purpose of this stage is to look at how many councillors are needed for the total number of electors, and then the localisation is the second stage when we start looking at warding arrangements. But yes, just to give some assurance that certainly the figure isn't an aspirational figure. It's based on a confidence that those numbers will be delivered in the next 5 years. And like Phil's already touched on, the Commission, when I've met with them previously, has been clear that they recognise that in some areas across the country, not necessarily Telford and Wrekin particularly, there are lower levels of registered electors. And although their work is based on the registered electors, they do have an eye to electors doesn't necessarily equal people, and therefore the people are what generate the work rather than the electors. And so that there is a view to that, which the proposed questionnaire for members will help to highlight and bring to life a little bit for the purpose of the submission. So that's one of the reasons we've suggested that questionnaire might be a worthwhile exercise. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anthea. Just briefly before I take questions from the next two members, the questionnaire to councillors is something that I'm particularly passionate about, because I would like us to be able to stringently benchmark the data that we have against other authorities that are similar to our own, and also, if possible, given that we're working to quite a tight deadline here, but to get a little snapshot of the impact of the pandemic upon our work as well. So hopefully we'll be able to have a look and see how that compares. I will now take questions from Councillor Holt, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think Anthony, you just filled in quite a few of the gaps I had there in the questions. But I wanted to know whether we use the same system to calculate projected numbers, projected residents, and if the external body would use the same system, and also whether the census would affect anything at all, whether it would give us any guidance to numbers.
Do you want me to answer that, Chair?
Yes, please, Phil.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, Councillor Holt, we would take the direction from the Boundary Commission in terms of how the stats were pulled together for growth, and a lot of that's in the local plan. They will again test that just to ensure that, and also they will use ONS population estimations, which are, I think, probably notoriously on the low side. I don't know, but I think we've seen that before. So we'll work with that there. And your other question, census-wise, I'm guessing probably by the time our work starts, that probably that will filter in further down the line. And I don't know how comparable the census data might be to the electoral registration data. That's just my view, but I think probably by the time that information's gathered, we'll probably well down the line of this review. Ultimately, it'll help us going forward in 5-6 years' time in terms of what the community's needs are. It's a shame perhaps that the timing wasn't a little bit more, a little earlier.
Thank you. Councillor Doug. Oh, sorry.
Chair, would you mind if I just added something? Is that all right?
Please. Yeah, thank you.
So it's just in terms of the methodology adopted for the projected growth. So the Boundary Commission, they do, as Phil said, they do look at the ONS statistics, but they're really clear that they'll rely on the information that we've given them, and then they'll test that information. So there's not a one size fits all in terms of the methodology. What they're looking for is a robust rationale for why we've adopted the methodology that we have, and evidence to support that. So for us, if we're looking at our housing growth, for example, we can demonstrate that we've met our housing numbers over the last few years, and there's no reason to suggest that that's slowed down at all. And that's a pattern that we've seen for several years now. So it will be us to present to them. They don't then go away and do their own calculation on the projected growth. They look at what we've presented and just test that to make sure it's robust.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillor Dugmore.
Yeah, thanks. Just two points really. I mean, Anthony partially answered it earlier on before. It's just where the growth figures came from. I mean, are they all sort of definite developments, or are they proposed developments, or areas that are earmarked for future development? It's just trying to pin it down. I appreciate the fact that, like you said, sort of the only thing guaranteed is it won't be spot on. But it's just to get some idea as to the brief that they had. And then the other thing is that if we could just have the presentation sent to us, that would be quite useful as well. So just so we can pass it on to all the members as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Chair, do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
First of all, I don't profess to be an expert statistician. That's the first thing to say. So this will probably be very simplistic. But my understanding is that it's a mixture of all of those things. So we know there are a number of planning permissions that have been granted but not yet implemented or completed. So they have been taken into account. We know that there are developments that are planned that are phased, and in this case, I'm thinking about Lawley particularly, where we know that there's another phase to come, and the amount that's to be delivered. And then we also know that within our local plan, we've got certain areas of allocation, certain areas of land that's allocated for housing. And what the team who is responsible for planning policy does is they're in regular contact with developers to test how likely it is that things will be brought forward within a period of time. And that's not for this process. That's one of the functions that they're required to do, so that we can keep an eye on our projected housing figures over the next few years, next 5 years, the 5-year housing land supply figures. And so it's based upon that as well in terms of those conversations. It's, as I said earlier, and as you've just alluded to, Councillor Dugmore, it's not an exact science, but the relationships we have with the developers tends to bear fruit that we're kind of in the right ballpark when it comes to assessing what's coming next. And so, added to the fact that it's a conservative estimate, we're fairly comfortable that all of those figures together can be relied upon.
Thank you, Anthea. Councillor Overton.
Yeah, it's just adding on to that. I mean, I do think that we should always be mindful of development, even though it's not, it's not in the current projects of 2027, because it will create, a difference later on if it's not calculated. I mean, I know in 2003 when this ward was created of St George's, we allocated some land that had got projected housing on it. In 2015 it started being built on, and now both fields have been built on now. And if that had been the case and we hadn't allocated that in, this ward would be over by quite a lot. But because we'd allocated in earlier on, we're probably under still with these projected figures. But I'm just saying, I think if someone's got a proper planning notes on there from the old TDC times, it is going to be developed and it should be added into the calculations, because that's what that land was allocated for in 1970. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen to 2027, but it might happen in 2031.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. Well made. Do we have further comment or questions from members or officers? No? Fabulous. Right. Well, I don't think we have further items this evening. So if members are happy to await guidance from Democratic Services about that flurry of meetings that we're going to have in April. Oh, yes, Anthea, sorry, I didn't see you there.
Chair, just for formality, we did make some recommendations. So could we just have an indication from the committee?
Sorry, tired.
that where I think what I heard was we're happy not to look at a reduction in numbers, but that officers are instructed to provide information on a council size in the range of 54 to 56, with the intention that we bring a submission back to the next committee meeting, or one of the next committee meetings. So, Chair, I'm just for the formality to make sure we're all understanding of what would be
quite right. Thank you. Angela, do you have a question or?
No, I'd actually like to move recommendation that Anthea's suggested. That was my view from the start. So
I'll second that.
I'll formally move that.
Thank you, Councillor McClements. Right, and that's seconded by Councillor Overton. Shall I take a show of hands then from our colleagues? Brilliant.
I think that's unanimous, Chair.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great. Well, onward and upward, and yes, and best of luck to our officers and their teams with the task ahead. Brilliant. Well, if we're happy with that, I'm happy to call a close to this meeting and thank everybody for their time. And hopefully the next one we will be free of technical errors. Yes, Councillor McClements. Or is that a hand error? Oh, you're muted.
That was a hand error.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so.
Have a lovely evening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.